he will not have sex 3 days a month with a self-made billionaire Latinx businesswoman. No, he will not enter into a marriage of convenience with her for a year, even if after that year she will give him enough money to save a struggling wine-growing kingdom. And no, he's certainly not going to have a royal baby with a stranger. But when he gets to her office, he meets her daunting assistant Helen and a computer screen on which the beautiful billionaire's face appears. Inwardly laughing at the farce of this situation, Mateo took a seat in a leather chair facing the screen. Apparently, Roxanne Medina couldn't be bothered to meet the man she wanted to marry in person. 2 minutes later, he was no longer laughing. She hadn't looked at him. She just kept scribbling, giving him nothing to look at but the palm tree swaying behind her and the part in her dark, shiny hair. He glanced at the nurse. She stared back, blank-eyed. He'd already cleared his throat twice. Fuck this. Excuse me, he began. Helen, it sounds like the prince may have a bit of a dry throat, Roxanne Medina spoke, finally, without raising her eyes from her document. Could you get him a glass of water? Of course, ma'am. As the nurse headed to a decanter, Mateo said, I don't need water. I'm trying to find out. Roxanne Medina raised one delicate finger to the screen. Without looking up, continuing to write. Without a word or a sound, Roxanne Medina shushed him, and Mateo, top of his field, head of his lab, a goddamn principe, he let her, out of shock and awe that another human being would treat him this way. He never treated people this way. He moved to stand to storm out when a water glass appeared in front of his face and a hair was tugged from his head. Ow, he yelled as he turned to glare at the granite-faced nurse holding a strand of his light brown hair. Fantastic, I see the tests have begun. Mateo turned back to the screen and pushed the water glass out of his way so he could see the woman who finally deigned to speak to him. Tess? She was beautiful. Of course she was beautiful. When you have billions of dollars at your disposal, you can look any way you want. Roxanne Medina was sky blue-eyed, high-breasted, and lush-lipped, with long and lustrous black hair. On the pixelated screen, he couldn't tell how much of her was real or fake. He doubted even her stylist could remember what was Botox, extended, and implanted. Still, she was striking. Mateo closed his mouth with a snap. Her slow, sensual smile let him know she'd seen him do it. Mateo glowered as Roxanne Medina slipped her delicate black reading glasses up on her head and aimed those searing blue eyes at him. These tests are just a formality. We've tested your father and sister and there were no genetic surprises. Great, he deadpanned. Why are you testing me? Her sleek eyebrows quirked. Didn't your father explain this already? A tiny gold cross hung in the V of her ivory silk top. We're testing for anything that might make the golden prince a less than ideal specimen to impregnate me. Madre de Dios. His father hadn't been delusional. This woman really wanted to buy herself a prince and a royal baby. The king had introduced him to some morally deficient people in his life, but this woman, his shock was punctuated by a needle sliding into his bicep. "Hold there!" Mateo yelled, turning to see a needle sticking out of him, just under his t-shirt sleeve. "Stop doing that!" "Hold still," the devil's handmaiden said emotionlessly, as if stealing someone's blood for unwanted tests was an everyday task for her. Rather than risk a needle breaking into his arm, he did stay still, but he glared at the screen. "I haven't agreed to any of this. The only reason I'm here is to tell you no. The king promised. My father makes a lot of promises. Only one of us is fool enough to believe them." She took the glasses off entirely, sending that hair swirling around her neck, and slowly settled back into her chair. The gold cross hid once again between blouse and pale skin. She stared at him the way he stared at the underside of grape leaves to determine their needs. Finally, she said, "Forgive me. We've started on different pages. I thought you were on board." Her voice, Mateo noticed, was throaty with a touch of scratch to it. "I run a multinational corporation. Sometimes I rush to the finish line and forget my pleases and thank yous. Helen, say you're sorry." "I'm sorry," Helen said immediately, as she pulled the plunger and dragged Mateo's blood into the vial. Gritting his teeth, he stared at the screen. What self-respecting person would have a kid with a stranger for money? "A practical one with a kingdom on the line," Roxanne Medina said methodically. "My money can buy you time. That's what you need to right your sinking ship, correct?" So Roxanne Medina begins to lay out all the ways this deal makes sense for him, and more importantly, for his nearly destitute kingdom. Her words push him further and further into a corner. Mateo pulled back from his navel-gazing to focus on her. She was watching him. Mateo saw her eyes travel slowly over the screen, taking him in, and he felt like a voyeur and exhibitionist at the same time. She bit her full bottom lip and then gave him a smile of promise. To put it frankly, Principe, your position and poverty aren't the only reasons I selected you. You're a fascinating man, and we're both busy, dedicated to our work, and not getting as much sex as we'd like. I'm looking forward to those 3 nights a month. Sex coming out of her lush mouth and that velvety voice had Mateo's libido sitting up and taking notice. That's right. He'd be having sex with this tempting creature on the screen. She tilted her head, sending all that thick black hair to one side and exposing her pale neck. I've had some thoughts about those nights in bed. The instant searing image of her arched neck while he buried his hand in her hair had Mateo tearing his eyes away. He looked out on the city. Jesus, she was right, it had been too long. And he didn't need his little brain casting a vote right now. She made it sound so simple. Gripping onto his higher ideals and shaky rationalizations, he picked up the pen and signed. The nurse plunked an empty plastic cup with a lid down on the desk. What the? Mateo said with horror. Just the final test, Roxanne Medina said cheerily from the screen. Don't worry, Helen left a couple of magazines in the bathroom. Just leave the cup in there when you're finished and she'll retrieve it. Any hopes for a reasonable future swirled down the drain. Roxanne Medina expected him to get himself off in a cup while this gargoyle of a woman waited outside the door. He stood and white-knuckled the cup, turned away from the desk. Fuck it. At least his people were safe. An hour earlier, his hands in the dirt, he thought he could save his kingdom with hard work and noble intentions. But he'd fall on his sword for them if he had to. Or stroke it. He had one last question for the woman who held his life in her slim-fingered hand. Why? He asked, his back to the screen, the question coming from the depths of his chest. Really, why? Why what? Why me? Because you're perfect. He could hear the glee in her rich voice, and I always demand perfection.